Hey, good morning, friends. As promised, we're back in Nehemiah 5. We're going to finish the chapter this morning, and we're going to see really the contrast that Nehemiah is going to take in contrast with the nobles and the officials here. Some interesting things as we wrap up this chapter that we can learn about Nehemiah and his leadership and how he tries to make sure that the people of Israel are taken care of and what they're doing with trying to restore the wall and seeing that Jerusalem is put back together the way that they had originally saw it and intended it to be done. They know that this work is from the Lord, and they want to honor and glorify Him. And Nehemiah is striving in all that he does to try to make these things possible. So, as we saw the confrontation that happened earlier in chapter 5, he confronts these nobles and officials, says you need to stop exacting interest out of these people. They are trying to make a way for themselves, and you're just making it even harder. He confronts them, he calls them to repentance. They agree, they promise, they swear their oath before the priests that they will not do this again, and things seem to settle down. Now, we see Nehemiah's side of things and how he is going to handle the situation. The problem hasn't completely been solved, but with the combination of Nehemiah's efforts, we're going to see a solution begin to arise here. So let's read the end of chapter 5, beginning in verse 14. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them for the daily ration 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. I also persevered in the work on this wall, and we acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. Moreover, there were at my table 150 men, Jews and officials, besides those that came to us from the nations that were around us. Now what was prepared at my expense for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep and birds, and every 10 days all kinds of wine in abundance. Yet for all this I did not demand the food allowance of the governor, because the service was too heavy on this people. Remember for my good, O God, all that I have done for this people. And so we see here Nehemiah's response to the situation and how he wants to see the people succeed. And if it wasn't clear up until this point, Nehemiah has been made the governor of the land of Judah. He's been installed for 12 years. Now, what a lot of scholars try to say is that it's very likely when Nehemiah first got here, this whole 12-year period of being governor was not the original idea. In fact, what likely would have happened is Artaxerxes would have sent Nehemiah out. He would have returned to Jerusalem. There would have been an initial time frame for him to be gone, say months to a year or so. And then realizing that this work is going to take longer than they originally had planned, there's some kind of correspondence between the king and Nehemiah, and his governorship is extended. That's likely what happens here at this point. But regardless of that, Nehemiah is serving at the pleasure of Artaxerxes. He is under the king. Now, what comes with this position of power and oversight, there are some fringe benefits in relation to economic status, in relation to culinary privileges, and so forth. And so apparently there is a special diet, or there's this abundance of food that is provided specifically for those who are in power under the king. And on top of this, as Nehemiah mentions in this part, the earlier part of this section, these previous governors not only had the right, but exercised the right to exact 40 shekels of silver from these people per day. Now, in today's standard of measurement, depending on the silver market, high or low, you're looking at between $550 and maybe $600 total. Shekels usually weigh about half an ounce, and a half an ounce of silver would run you right now about $13 or so. And so, but that's still a hefty amount of money. I mean, $550 to $600 per day for the governor to just arbitrarily say, that's mine, and to take that from you. And if that's not bad enough, to add insult to injury, they're recorded as lording it over the people. This isn't like, hey, I'm sorry, guys, but I need this money. or I'm sorry, but this is what I'm required to do per the authority of the king. No, no, no. This isn't something being done in secret. This isn't something being done with an apology. This is very public. This is very overt. They wanted the people to know before Nehemiah, these guys wanted them to know who was in charge, who was rich, who was the overseer, who's the big man on campus. Look, I'm allowed to take this from you, and I'm going to take it from you. And I don't care how much it hurts you. I don't care how much it costs you. I don't care what kind of a problem it creates. But yet Nehemiah doesn't do any of these things. In fact, he rejects this smorgasbord that's offered to him as part of his position of power. He doesn't take the money from his people. If you notice here, it said, and took from them for their daily ration 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. And so he doesn't take the money. And realistically, not only is he acting different from those that have filled his position before, but I think one of the greater reasons that Nehemiah responds this way, as you recall from our last devotional time, he's acting in a completely polar fashion than to how the other more affluent Jews treated their own. And so then he states clearly the reason. He is not doing this to win the favor of the people, although no doubt he probably did as a result. He's not doing this because he wants to look better than his fellow brethren, the ones that had the money, that had the riches, although probably naturally he would anyway. But he does it because, as he says, of the fear of God. He's not doing this for himself. He's doing this because he wants to honor the God of heaven. He wants God to be glorified in this situation and not himself. He knows that God is watching. And I'm sure he also understands and knows that even though Artaxerxes has sent him here, has elevated him to this position of power. I mean, going from the cupbearer to now being the governor of Judah, that is no small thing. That's a big deal. And as we see, all of the other fringe benefits that come with that. But even though he knows Artaxerxes has made him governor of Judah, he also realizes the God who has caused Artaxerxes to put him in this position of power. See, in reality, Nehemiah understands that all of this that's happening in his life is because of God, because of his providence, because of his divine decrees here. He is a man who wants to seek to be a good steward of the resources that are before him. And part of that stewardship is stewarding the authority that he has. And one of the ways he does that is verse 16 points out for us. I also persevered in the work on this wall, and we acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. So rather than taking time, which he very well could have, taking time off to go find a plot of land, hey, where do I want to settle myself in Judah, to pick a choice piece of property, to take his servants and maybe, siphon them off and say, hey, I want you to work on this piece of property. This is going to be mine. I want you to get this ready. These other people can take care of themselves while they're working on the wall. Nehemiah doesn't do any of that. He and his servants, rather than making himself his own, castle, as it were, his place he wants to reside in Judah, he's leading by example again. He joins his comrades in the work. He's helping to rebuild the wall. He is physically getting involved with everyone, and even though he's the governor, even though he's in charge and he's supposed to be leading, he is leading by working, by getting down in the trenches with these people. He's got a passion to see this through. And listen, yes, Nehemiah's got privileges and power and great possessions that we're going to look at in a moment. Yet he doesn't flaunt any of that. He doesn't want to use any of that for his own personal advantage. His desire is to live like anybody else and to see that the wall is completed. So now we look at the last part of chapter 5. In verse 17 it says, moreover, there were at my table 150 men, Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Now what was prepared at my expense for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep and birds, and every 10 days all kinds of wine in abundance. Yet for all this I did not demand the food allowance of the governor, because the service was too heavy on this people. One of the reasons we can see very clearly at the end of verse 18 is he doesn't want to take advantage of his rights, as it were, in his position of authority, because he doesn't want to be the reason that there are extra burdens placed on the people. Again, he's thinking, like Paul says in Philippians, thinking about others better than himself. But notice the generosity of Nehemiah. You know, it's clear here that this is a man that has an abundance of resources, whether these are given to him by the king or whether these are things that he has accumulated over the years by his own position of power. Regardless, he's not using it to his personal advantage. He's not hoarding it and accumulating it just to spend on himself. Notice in the passage, he's feeding at least 150 people a day. But quite likely that number could easily be double or triple that, because as it says in verse 17, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. I mean, that could be a few dozen. It could be another 100 plus people. We don't know. But we know that at least 150 people of the Jews are being served daily at this table. Not the king's table, but at Nehemiah's table. Now, is this a massive table that would have fed all these people at one time? More than likely not. Although the largest table has been found to be in India, that it seated 100 people at a time. People in Persian nations did have large dining room areas, but more than likely this would have been a rotating shift of people coming in and out. And this is just the sheer number of people that Nehemiah would have been able to feed over the course of a day. Yet he's using it to feed others. Now, to put this in perspective, he's sacrificing 1 ox, 6 sheep, 6 birds, and procuring this abundance of wine, whatever copious amount that is, every 10 days. Now, if we calculate that out over the 12 years that Nehemiah served as governor, let's say he has all of these resources from day 1 to the last day of year 12, okay? Just as a hypothetical, we're talking about 26,280 sheep, 26,280 birds, 4,380 oxen, plus again, these copious amounts of wine that were set out for these people. Every 10 days, this would have been done 438 times over a 12-year span. That's a lot of cattle. That's a lot of resources. And he's feeding 150 plus people a day with these offerings. But yet again, rather than keeping it to himself, he is freely sharing it. This is a man who's being incredibly generous with the resources that he has. You know, in addition, he could have taken advantage of the king's allowance of food on top of all that, but at his own expense, he says in the latter part of this chapter. Verse 18, now what was prepared at my expense for each day. He does this graciously. He does this lovingly. He does this sacrificially because he loves his people. He could have taken advantage of the other benefits of being the governor, but he doesn't. He loves his people dearly, and he desires to see that they are blessed also by his prosperity and by his wealth. And then we see this short little prayer at the end of chapter 5. Remember for my good, O my God, all that I have done for this people. He simply says, Lord, I pray that you would see that what I am doing is not for my glory, but I'm doing it for this people. I'm doing it because they are made in the image of God. I'm doing it because you love these people. And because you love these people, I also love these people. And I want to care for them and serve them in any way that I can. So, as we're talking about a guy who's got a lot of resources, who's got a lot of wealth, who's freely bestowing it to other people, what are we supposed to take away from this passage? Many of us are probably thinking, you know what? I'm not in that situation. I don't have an abundance of wealth. I'm barely scraping by. I'm getting my bills paid, sure. I might have enough money to get the groceries that I need, but I'm not living in the lap of luxury. Yet at the same time, we could ask ourselves, with whatever resources we're given, in an abundance, whether there's excess or there's a deficit, let me ask us all the same question. How do we use those resources to glorify God? How do we use those resources when we can to bless others? It could be time. It could be money. It could be skills. How do we try to make it a point to bless others with the blessings that God gives us? And when we do, when we are pouring ourselves into the lives of others, when we are sharing, when we are trying to support someone, are we thinking, how are other people going to see me? Are we thinking about the comments or the compliments that we might get as a result? Who's going to notice? Who's going to, give us that intellectual trophy or that pat on the back that says that we're doing a great job? Or are we praying to God like Nehemiah did in verse 19? Oh God, remember for my good all that I'm doing for these people. That I want you to know, that I want you to see that I'm doing this because I love you and therefore I love others as a result. This is a pretty strong contrast to the situation we saw in our last devotion, isn't it? It's a pretty strong contrast to these other people that use their wealth to take advantage of others. Whereas what Nehemiah illustrates for us, and as I would argue, he shows us the more Christian example of what we should do with the resources that we have. This is a man who loves these people, and he wants to lead them to the best of his ability, but ultimately for the glory of God. So that wraps up chapter 5 for us, and we'll start looking at chapter 6 next time.